Alright, moving right along here. This lesson I'd like to cover, the previous lesson we left off covering objects, classes, properties, events, and I'd like to cover methods here. And I'm also going to start covering Chapter 4, how to work with numeric and string data. So if you're looking at the Chapter 3 PowerPoint, we're kind of in the middle between there, but I'd like to start covering Chapter 4 as well. So Chapter 3, the end of Chapter 3 starts covering method signatures and methods and comments. So I want to cover methods and method signatures, and then we're going to start working with numerics and string data. So I'll try to just do them both at the same time for this lecture. So let's start covering methods. So you can always tell if you're calling a method because of these parentheses. So that's how you know a method is being called. If you see something has parentheses, then it's probably a method. So for instance, let's look at this decimal subtotal. So we're trying to figure out the subtotal for our invoice total application. So here we have the text property of our subtotal text box. So we know that whatever the user enters there is going to be the subtotal. But first we have to make sure that whatever the user entered is actually useful, is actually some sort of integer or number or decimal, whatever the case may be. We want to actually make sure that if we add or subtract to it that we're able to. So the first thing we want to do is convert that to a decimal to ensure that that thing is actually a decimal. So notice that we have this open parenthesis and closing parenthesis here. So we know that it's being sent to a method that's actually converting that thing to a decimal. So it's a little bit of abstraction. We don't really know what it's doing or what that method is doing, but we know that if we send this text property, that we're going to get back some sort of subtotal or some sort of decimal that we can now work with as a decimal. So if we F12 into this method, we know that the parameter of this method should take a string object, and it should return a decimal. So let's make sure that it does it. Let's click on this and F12 and make sure the compiler isn't lying to us. And here, in fact, if we look at this method, we can see that it's public, so we can call it from external classes. It's static, so don't worry about the static keyword too much. I'll cover static here in a minute. And it returns a decimal, so the next type, whenever all of these types are what these methods return. And then here's the value that it takes in. So we actually are looking at this method down here. That's a string that takes in a string value and returns a decimal. So here's the comments. It converts the specified string representation to an equivalent number. Here, let me try to scoot this over a little bit. It tells you the parameters, the string that contains a number to convert. It returns a decimal that is equivalent to the number in value, or 0 if the value is null. So if we did send a null string, it would return a 0. So if we had some sort of decompiler, we could actually see what this method does. I don't have a decompiler installed at the moment, so all it's going to show you is the signature to this method. So if we go back to the code window here, we can see that it gets sent to this convert class. So now if we F12 on this convert class, we can see that this convert class is static, and the convert class has all of these methods that we can send things to that'll convert things for us. So all the static keyword does is it tells us that this method can be called in our class without having to instantiate it, without having to new it up. So another word for instantiation is I want to say new up. So that's when we can say, for example, button equals new button. So if we go back to our designer window, we can see this new keyword is used whenever we want to make an instance of a class. So that's what I mean by newing something up. I want to make a new text box. I want to make a new label. I want to make a new button. But if we come back here to this, you don't see anything. You never see a new. I never had to new up my convert class. And that's because it's static. It can exist outside of my class without a new keyword. So a lot of people use static classes for more utility operations. They want to be able to call it whenever they want. So that's when you use the static convert class. So we want to convert to a decimal, whatever was in this text box, and then it's going to return a decimal type. So how about if I wanted to have all of this logic done somewhere else and not in this calculate click event? Maybe this calculate click event is getting a little bit cumbersome, it's getting a little large, it's getting difficult to read. Maybe I want to split this logic out into its own method. That way whoever comes to my code later can see that it's easier to read for them, it's easier to manage, it's easier to maintain. So let's abstract this out into another method. So what am I going to need? This method's going to need to know the subtotal and it might need to know the discount percent, and then it should return. Now what do I want my method to do? I'm going to send it a subtotal and it's going to return a discount percent. How about that? So let's say the discount percent is equal to calculate discount percent. And remember, if it's a method, it's going to have open and closing parentheses. So I can give it a parameter list. And in my parameter list, I'm going to send it the subtotal. So I'm going to say, hey, based on my subtotal, figure out what the discount percentage and return that back to me. So the first thing my compiler is going to do is it's going to say, I don't have this method in my class anywhere. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Okay, I've seemed to forget the shortcut. I thought it was Control-Shift-Enter, Control-Shift period. Nope, that's not it. Alright, maybe I'll have to look that up for the next video. Anyways. So now I'm going to calculate this discount percent based on this method. And if you control period on this method, you can tell the compiler to generate the method for you. And then let's cut this out. And I want to put that logic now in this method. So here's my calculate discount percent method based on my subtotal. So it takes in a decimal subtotal. And I'm going to paste that logic back in here. So now it's going to want a discount percent. So let's also send, no, I don't want to send the discount percent. So instead of this, I want to just return. So if the radio button yes is checked and the subtotal is between 100 and 200, I'm going to return a discount percent of 0.1. So let's go ahead and copy and paste the returns down here. return 0.2, return 0.25. So if the radio button .checked is checked, I'll also put in an else. So if none of those conditions exist, return 0. So if the radio button yes is checked, and any of these are true, return that. Otherwise, return 0. But notice I still get an error up here because what happens if this radio button isn't checked? So if this radio button isn't checked, also again just return 0. And now my error should go away. So if my radio button yes is checked, I'm going to figure out all of these. Otherwise, return 0. If it's not checked, again, return 0. So if we wanted to reduce nesting, if we wanted to reduce all these curly braces, what I could say that if this radio button yes is not checked, the first thing I want to do is return 0. And then I can get rid of these curly braces. Bring this in a little bit. Okay. So if my radio button yes is not checked, which means the no button is checked, I'm not a Premier customer, I'm going to return a 0 discount percent. Otherwise, then I can start going through this logic to calculate the discount percent again. So notice that this if doesn't have any curly braces. So I can do that because I only have one return statement. So if I did put curly braces around it, it's still fine. I can do this. And it never hurts to be a little bit more explicit. If my radio button yes is checked to do this, I could, and then if I had multiple statements, statement 2, statement 3, I can still do that. But since I only have one statement after my if, I don't need to have the curly braces. But then if I have more than one statement, they're going to be ignored. So these will be ignored because I don't have curly braces. So notice if I put if my radio button is checked, I want these two things to happen. And notice I get a compile error. And all of this gets grayed out because it knows that none of this is going to happen. So it's always good just to have the curly braces around these, just to be explicit. But just know it's not a requirement, so I might not do it all the time. I might forget to put curly braces around it. So it can happen either way. So if my radio button yes is not checked, return no discount percentage. Otherwise, go through all of this logic to calculate my discount percent. And now, this is a private method because the only person that needs to know about this method is my form. That returns a decimal and that takes in a decimal. So I'm going to minimize this. Go back up to my code and notice that it's a lot less code, or it seems to be a lot less code since I abstracted away how I calculate my discount percent a little bit. And it's a lot more readable. So my discount percent is equal to whatever my calculate discount percent returns to me. And then again, here's that kind of if that I don't have curly braces around. So that's why I don't have curly braces around it. Okay, so notice that this calculate button click event is a method too that takes in two parameters that we just don't use. This is considered a delegate type. And we'll go over delegates when we start covering events. That's why this has these two parameters. That's why it has this parameter list. This initialize components is a method. You can notice that because of the parentheses again, it just doesn't take any parameters. If you go into this initialize components and you F12 into it, this is where all of our components are being instantiated. These are constructors for the method, so that these are all methods. We'll cover constructors when we start covering object-oriented concepts a little bit further, in particular encapsulation. So don't worry about too much about what these are. That's why they're after a class name, so it's kind of weird to see parentheses after a class name because this isn't a method, but what happens inside the class is a method. So again, this is a special case that we'll cover when we cover encapsulation. And that's about it. So we'll continue to cover methods further on as the course goes on. We'll make different kinds of methods that return decimals, methods that return objects, methods that return strings, methods that take in objects, take in strings, take in decimals, take in multiple different types of parameters. So with anything else, the world is your oyster. You can design it however you would like. There's always 1,600 different ways to solve problems using programming. It's all how you want to design it. So with that being said, I'm going to start the next lecture of Chapter 4 covering numerics and string data. Thanks for watching.